Right. Zara, it would be great if you could give me a cue when you think it would be best to start. Just gonna wait one more minute, I guess.
Yeah, I think we're good to start.
Okay, I'm going to start. Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum, good evening to whoever is joining from Pakistan and from outside as well. My name is Khushbakht Fatima Jamal, currently working as the Partnership and Capacity Strengthening Manager at Better Cotton, which is a sustainability initiative for cotton around the world. I have here with me today a fellow panelist, Jess Rudder. Jess, I'll let you introduce yourself and then we'll talk about the topic.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. My name is Jess Rudder. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago in the Development Innovation Lab. And my background is as an agricultural economist. So I work on mostly climate change adaptation projects in other countries.
Great. It's great to have you, Jess. Thanks for finding the time. Um, to all the participants, it would be great if you guys could just drop in your name and wherever you're logging in from. Couple of quick housekeeping rules. Zara, please feel free to add them. We'll take questions towards the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. But if you have comments or questions even during the discussion, please write those in the chat. I'll try to take to take as many during the conversation, but if not, I promise to try and get through most of them towards the end. Is there anything else, Zara, that we need to add for housekeeping?
No, we're good. Thanks, Pushpa.
Great. No worries. Thanks, Sarah. So talking very quickly about the agenda that we have for today, my understanding is this is the last session for Global this year. So I hope the season has gone well, participants have enjoyed. We'll conclude this week with hopefully an interesting discussion on impact evaluation, and challenges in both climate change interventions and their evaluations. The topic says mitigation, but I think I'm going to open it for both mitigation and adaptation. We're going to briefly set the context a little bit. We'll talk about the two-way relationship between climate and agriculture, both it as a victim but also a contributor to climate change. And then we'll focus the discussion on how impact evaluations are generally carried out in climate change related interventions, both related to mitigation and or adaptation. And then we'll deep dive into one of Jess's recent projects that she has been working on for the past couple of years or so in Pakistan. And we'll keep the last few minutes for question and answers. Any comments or questions from you, Jess, before we start, or the SERP team?
No, that sounds great. Just to apologize because it's morning here, so I will be sipping on coffee. So I hope that's not distracting.
No worries, not at all. Thank you. All right, so I think it's buzzword enough by itself, and humans we all have been around in this world for a long time, perhaps millions of years. But we've really started emitting serious and various forms of carbon only recently, more after the Industrial Revolution, so about 200 years, where we've essentially brought us to the same levels where the global carbon, what it took millions of years to sort of accumulate and be emitted, we've sort of bypassed that already in the last 200 years or so. Many participants in this call are observers, as well as you, Jess, and others might have seen so many different graphs by now with what will happen with business as usual if you don't do anything to mitigate carbon emissions. What do we need to do to really try and arrest the increase in global warming to 1.5 degrees if you want to have a livable planet? And again, despite these graphs, it's important to note that a lot of these averages or predictions are more global. And some regions or some countries and regions within countries are bound to be hit a lot more in one direction, while others less so. In Pakistan, I think the numbers usually does not vary between fourth to sixth, but we're supposedly the fifth or the sixth most vulnerable countries to climate change in the world. Um, and there are efforts, right? Efforts and interventions that aim to achieve or this objective of trying to arrest the increase in carbon emissions that we're doing. And usually those are the ones that we classify under the mitigation category. We're making progress towards it, but apparently not fast enough. We have things like renewable energy sources. We've developed hybrid electric cars. We're trying to reduce energy consumption, cutting down on deforestation, or running things like the billion tree tsunami in Pakistan. So options do exist as far as when it comes to reducing carbon emissions across various sectors. But the narrative, at least right now, both academically, scientifically, and policy-wise, is that these efforts are not enough to reduce the emissions and also to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Um, um, so, so, the, so essentially, the idea is that this is not something which is being heard for the first time. We know that there are efforts and interventions, both natural solutions that people are trying to replicate more so, and then there are also engineered solutions. Bioenergy, directly air capture of carbon, weathering solutions, and whatnot. And on the natural side, there is reforestation, agroforestry, and others. But just, I think maybe my first question to you is, with this is all mitigation related, but when it comes to agriculture and a country like Pakistan, where although agriculture is a big emitter or one of the largest in the world, around a third of the global emissions are usually attributed to agriculture. But in Pakistan itself, being such a small emitter of carbon, and with a very vast majority of population that is being affected instead. Can you talk a bit more about what it means when we say climate adaptation, especially in the agricultural um, context, and what are or could be some of the leading strategies or tools when it comes to climate change adaptation and agriculture?
Sure. Thank you, Kushbak. I think she mentioned that I've been working on a project in Pakistan where we're delivering weather forecast information to farmers. And the idea there is to understand people's adaptation when they have a better sense of high quality weather forecasts. And so she was also didn't mention, but we were actually collaborators on that project. So she was very much involved in the design and doing the surveys and setting up the project. So she also has all of the technical insights that one requires for this type of work. I think, of course, one of the most challenging things from the perspective of adaptation for a smallholder farmer in a low income setting is that you're already working in a system, and the system being agriculture, where you're constantly facing shocks, right? And so if we compare kind of from a broad perspective, some of the differences between the way that agriculture functions in, say, the United States or Europe, and the way that agriculture functions in many low income settings, is that there's a bunch of policy supports in place in the US and Europe that mitigate the risk exposure for farmers, right? And so farmers, if they face risk, they are insured, they have access to credit, they have access to resources that enable technology adoption. Whereas in low income settings, you just do not see the extent of policy supports in place. And so some of it is there, like some places have price floors to have a guaranteed minimum price for farmers. I think that's the case for cotton. But of course, this kind of lack of broad scale policies is an enormous challenge. And so then when you're a smallholder farmer and you're facing different climate shocks that happen all the time, it just disables the potential of reaching any type of secure equilibrium in terms of the patterns of farming activities that you have to do in order to ensure a certain level of output, right? And so when we think about adaptation, what does that mean, right? It means, practices that improve resilience, practices on farm that it contribute toward a more stable yield year after year, right? And so if you get a good yield one year based on certain practices, and those yields then fall apart in the second year because the weather system was different, then it's not a sustainable practice, right? It's not a resilient practice. And so I haven't seen really consistent work that points to a package of practices that improve resilience across the board. And my sense is that it's something that has to be highly tailored. And so when we're talking about cotton farmers in Pakistan, we have to think about what are the sets of practices that make the most sense within that context.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Jess, for setting the context. Um, I mean, yes, of course, when it comes to cotton in Pakistan, it is being grown in areas which are highly vulnerable to climate, right? I mean, we have it in the southern parts of Punjab, the upper parts of Sindh, and then a little bit of organic cotton is also being grown in parts of Balochistan, all of which are economically difficult areas in terms of development. So we're already starting with a baseline with people who have relatively lower economic, educational, socioeconomic indicators. And then on top of that, they're also the ones who are constantly at the verge of facing shocks year on year, sometimes more than once in a year. So I mean, we had the floods, and then immediately after that, we had the heat waves, and then hopefully this year, we're praying to God that none of those two happen, but we're already above the historical average when it comes to the temperatures. So agreed with your assessment on adaptation being the more dominant agenda for climate change, especially in a country like Pakistan, and then further within that for a value chain like cotton wheat in the areas where it's grown. Um, so let's talk now a bit more about the evaluation or measurement or monitoring of interventions that are targeted to address climate change, right? I mean, both in terms of adaptation and also for mitigations. And for folks who are less aware, adaptation, as just mentioned, is more about building resilience of communities, protecting livelihoods and incomes. So coming up with both on-farm and off-farm tools and techniques where farmers and their households can try and protect and stabilize their livelihoods, their farm yields, farm profits, incomes, year on year, season on season, to the extent that any new shock that may emerge does not take them back to ground zero. And conversely, if we really have to divide the two, then mitigation is more on the technical side, right? So you're adopting certain techniques or tools which are either lowering your emissions in the atmosphere or just removing the carbon that's already there. Um, and for mitigation, right now, at least as far as the world goes, there are still credit markets being developed. There are more than 100 I was reading yesterday, carbon credit markets or standards that are being developed, some related to agriculture, some related to other sectors. But adaptation is more closely related to what we need in Pakistan, right? So perhaps, Jess, can you talk a bit more about what sort of data and indicators are important when it comes to adaptation? We'll talk in more detail when you describe your project, but the broader adaptation related interventions, very basically, what would be a minimum baseline that one should and would have to do to then implement any intervention related to adaptation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess one way that we can think about it is from taking things from a small scale up to a large scale, right? And so if you're testing a set of practices or you're testing certain technologies, of course, these things tend to come from agronomists, right? And they're done in a scientific setting and you have a controlled trial. And then as you scale up, it just gets gradually more and more messy and you have more and more measurement error, right? So part of what social scientists do is they take things that are tested by agronomists and they attempt to kind of bring them into a larger scale in terms of introducing them directly to farmers that would potentially benefit. And so at that stage, what you have to have is really high quality data collection to make sure that you're measuring input usage and production, right? So that's kind of like the main tool of an agricultural economist is that you're kind of laser focused on yields, right? So you want to know how much production you got per area planted. But you also want to know something about profitability. And of course, these measures are tremendously difficult in a smallholder setting because if we think about what profits measure, it measures sort of the revenue that you get minus the inputs that you spent. But some input expenditures are not exactly observed and particularly related to
Mm,
household labor. So if you're attending a plot as a smallholder farmer, you're probably not tracking the amount of time that you spend on it on a daily basis. And so, of course, if the recommendation includes practices that increase the amount of household labor required, but that labor isn't valued in the profit function, then something's going to look more profitable than it may really be, right? And
mm,
so, of course, we're all individuals and we all have different time preferences. So farmers have different preferences for how they want to spend their time. And so it's difficult to make a judgment on that based on profits, thinking about the piece of labor. And then on the other side, and this matters more for subsistence production. So if you're a farmer that's growing food that you both are selling to the market and consuming, then that also messes up the other side of the profit calculation because you have to compute revenues. But some of that food you're keeping for yourself. And so
mm,
how you decide to value that home consumption, that's going to change how you interpret profits, right? So
yeah.
there's these pieces, once you bring smallholder production into the setting of a household where things are not perfectly understood or perfectly valued in sort of this kind of like economic rational actor sense, right? That's where you're really going to have a type of variation that can lead you to make different decisions depending on how you value those inputs.
Oh, perfect. I think both hard points that we were struggling to gather data on. Yes, I remember we've
Absolutely.
spent so many hours on trying to minimize the noise when it comes to these set of indicators. Perhaps also about the yield, right? I mean, that's the intermediate outcome. So we've talked about the input usage. We've talked about the final money we're making from the sale of a certain crop, and then the yield itself. I think that's supposedly the most controversial of the lot because most of the times across the world we keep hearing that yield data collection is almost always the noisiest. So in your recent work in the last year or so, have you come across other more successful or more reliable methodologies for yield estimation? I know there's a lot of talk these days about usage of satellite data. We have a few emerging agri-techs within Pakistan and outside who are trying to use remote sensing technology to estimate the yield and then trying to ground truth it as well. What do you have to say about that? And beyond that, are there other tools that you've come across as useful alternatives to just asking the farmer to what your yield was in the last season, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we need the yield information to be able to assess sort of that resilience over time, right? We need to know if something performs well in a variety of weather settings. And I think remote sensed and satellite data is currently very effective for measuring land use change. So that's like another piece here, right? Is so if something becomes profitable for a farmer, a whole set of farmers to enact, it could increase the profitability so much that it induces land use change. And so that conversion of lands that were not were not used in agriculture previously, that's something that contributes to that kind of goes in the costing budget of
Mm,
contributing toward carbon emissions. And so, if you're looking at estimates of how farming contributes to carbon emissions, a huge portion of that is just thinking about land use change. And so you want to increase, that's why increasing productivity is so important, because you want to increase the intensity that you can harvest something on the same plot of land. But of course, there's equilibrium effects. And so we know that as something becomes more profitable, it would likely induce land use change. And so I think satellite data currently is very effective at understanding land use change. That's something that can be measured with precision. And so if you have something at scale and you want to be able to monitor whether it's inducing land use change, or on the reverse side, that you're retaining land as forest or retaining land as in fallow, that's something that I think you can actively do now. In terms of using satellite data to measure yields, I think that's still a little bit at the frontier. So there's been a lot of really good work, particularly coming out of a lab at Stanford, where they've developed systems to estimate yield on smaller plots, particularly for maize. But those estimates have to be calibrated for every crop, and I think calibrated for every location. So if, of course, we work together on a cotton farming system, and if you can't use a satellite yield machine learning algorithm that's tailored toward maize, because that's going to look at greenness, and cotton is a crop where you really want to look at, like, I don't know, whiteness or fluffiness of the crop. I'm not sure what it looks like from satellites, but so it's a good example of there's still not quite the kind of packages available to be able to run those things in a local project.
Great. And just very briefly, on the more technical mitigation side, where increasingly global commitments, national commitments, organizational commitments, to reduce emissions, and there are so many related indicators. I mean, at least when it comes to agriculture, we're going to talk about SOC, SOM, what the soil organic matter will be 2 years from now after implementing a certain intervention, so soil organic carbon, what will be the gas emissions themselves look like. And there's no convergence, I would say, at least as far as the third GHG emissions is concerned, and something that's also widely applicable. From what my understanding is that for GHG emissions, there's either no existing standard methodology that one could adopt for, let's say, all the things related to agriculture. And even if there are certain methodologies that have been developed, they're either too expensive or just not applicable, or the relevant expertise is not available in a lot of lower and middle income countries. Do you know, or can you shed a bit more light on that?
For like measuring greenhouse gas emissions directly, that's a good question. As far as I know, this may be out a little bit of my, I may be like stepping on the edge of my expertise a little bit here. So I'm not sure, because everything kind of matters at the scale that you're operating at, right? So if you hypothesize that you're working on a project that's going to have benefits in terms of carbon sequestration or mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, at whatever scale you're working at, let's say you're working in 100 locations, you might not have enough power to be able to detect differences in satellite readings based on whatever you're looking at, depending on what your measure is, right? So you may want to just go back to first principles if you want to think about things like that. So that's going back to the agronomic data and going back to what agronomists have been able to measure based on more controlled plots. And so I think this is common when researchers or when practitioners are promoting climate resilient practices. Usually those things have good measures in an agronomic setting, and then you just kind of have to make the assumption that if other people are doing it, then it has good results as well. And so I think we talked a little bit about this idea of no tillage or conservation agriculture, where you're discouraging the use of tractors to till lands because that tillage produces carbon emissions, right? And so that's a good example of something where it would probably be very difficult to measure the exact emissions on a plot that has reduced its tillage, but you could probably calibrate an estimate based on what you expect the savings to be over the size of the land and over a period of time. But I think at this stage, that kind of estimation would be a little ad hoc.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's exactly it. So yes, I think I'm really interested considering it's been a while since we worked on the project together, and I've gotten a bit rusty, but I know that you've presented your findings recently to a few conferences. So let me take that opportunity to go back and maybe talk a bit more about the project that you and I worked on for the weather forecast services that were being provided to cotton farmers, and what was that project about? What really led you to design your research question? And if so, please do share a few more insights on the intervention itself and what is it that we had set out to achieve.
Awesome, definitely can do. So the project that we started working on together, which was awesome because we got to meet and collaborate together for about a year in 2022 when we were starting this project, we were working with SERP and Precision Development. So that's called PXD. And what they do is they provide advisory services to smallholder farmers using mobile phones. So in some contexts, that means sending out text messages. And in this context, it meant sending out automated voice messaging. And so the farmer receives sort of, I think in Pakistan, it says 6007, right? And they know that that's a message from, it is also in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture in Punjab. So they see that the message comes from 6007, and then they can answer it, and they know that they're going to get some advice about managing their cotton farming practices. And that advice is tailored to the timing of the agricultural cycle. So it might say, now is the time to start planting. The time frame is in mid-April or so. And then it might give suggestions about how to manage fertilizer use thereafter. And so when I came on the project, they were deciding to deliver weather forecast information in addition to that advisory information. And so, of course, when providing weather information, that means that the farmer is getting a daily call that tells them, or daily or every other day that tells them the expected rainfall and temperature in their tehsil for the following day. So what it provides is sort of more granular and higher frequency touch points with weather information. And so, of course, farmers do have access to some weather information even before the project started, right? So you can get weather information on the TV. There might be some on the radio, and some. I think in our setting, it's around 30% of farmers have access to a smartphone, and so you might have access to Google or some other kind of location-based services that will tell you the weather. But in general, it was not something that people had access to on a broad scale. And during piloting, people indicated through surveys that they wanted to have high frequency weather data. That kept coming up. So that's kind of interesting from the perspective of if you are trying to implement programming that has a really high impact on farmers. We hear over and over again that farmers want to hear weather information, and they want to hear daily weather information in particular. And so we think about, okay, what are the types of practices that having weather information would change for farmers? And there's a couple of things, a couple of main buckets that people think about. And so one thing that really matters, and this matters in other farming systems more than cotton, but you want to time your planting to be in step with the monsoon season. And so you want to have a high quality monsoon onset forecast so that you can form expectations about when rain is going to be sustained, right? Because what can happen with monsoon onset is that you get a signal that it's raining, but then actually you have a long dry spell afterwards. And so that's a really big source of a shock for a smallholder farmer, is if you plant and then you end up with a dry spell and then you have to end up replanting because you don't get germination. Cotton production, where we were working on with this weather project, actually the planting begins in April, like well ahead of the monsoon onset. So people weren't exactly timing cotton with monsoon onset because it was still several months out. But nonetheless, farmers were asking for that sort of high frequency information about about the forecast. So what we decided to do was to track really closely the types of farming activities that farmers were doing throughout the season. And
Mm.
so, if you're a cotton farmer, you are first deciding when to plant, but then you're also making decisions about when to irrigate, when to fertilize, when to use pesticides, right? So cotton production is input intensive. So farmers are, they're purchasing their inputs and then they're deciding when to apply them. And then, of course, there's a lot of labor that works on farm for cotton production as well. And so what we see is we see that movement in the timing of these farming activities. So farmers are taking the weather information and they're deciding to apply fertilizer on days that it doesn't rain. And they're actually timing their irrigation on days that it doesn't rain. And so the way that we interpret that is that farmers are increasing their resource efficiency using this weather information, right? So if there's some cost to using irrigation and you can time that so that you don't have to use irrigation when you know it's going to rain, then that's a savings for you. Even if, from my understanding, people don't face variable costs for their
Mm.
irrigation that often, but it still takes time, it still takes resources, people are still motivated to save resources when possible. And so we see that. We see that, people aren't applying inputs on days that it rains, and that's important. And part of that we don't exactly see in profits, right? Because you're still applying the input, but it's more about the timing of the application. And so it doesn't,
Mm.
in our setting, we don't really see a huge bump in yields or a change in profits, but we don't think that since it's just a reallocation within that, it's really more about making this argument about what's valuable to the farmer. It shows clear evidence that they're attending the information and that it's important to them. And then you can make an argument too about resource efficiency, which is something, again, that maybe isn't going exactly in that profit function in a way that's used in typical measurement and evaluation, but nonetheless, you can kind of step back and make this argument directly.
Great. So I think I can add a little bit more context. I remember that when we were trying to design the project, we did try and do a lot of conversations with the farmers to try and understand what is it that they wanted when it came to climate change, or what is it that they felt they were most vulnerable to, and what potential services in terms of information could be helpful for them. And one thing that was perhaps supported by an overwhelming majority, both between cotton and wheat seasons, was this demand of accurate weather forecasts. And as you rightly said, I mean, right now, at least in the last 2 to 3 years, there have a lot of new weather forecasting providers have emerged in the agri-tech space, in the agri-tech space. But at that point, it was still fairly newish. And just that step from district level weather forecast information, this was something that most farmers had access to. Even at a tehsil level forecast was considered a lot more pertinent and granular. Again, we know that weather is even more granular when it comes to what it can or cannot create. But because of certain operational limitations, and we can talk about those as well as when it comes to more rigorous data collection, we were facing limitations on two sides, right? To be able to provide farmer information about that is most pertinent to his or her particular location, you need their location. And when we say their location, a GPS marked coordinate of their farm or wherever they're located. And then we need to be able to use the satellite information to map it exactly on the grid as where these 100 farmers will fall on that 2 by 2 matrix. And those were some of the limitations that we had started to face, right? And that's why at that particular project we decided to settle for tehsil, which was much better than district, but not as granular as maybe technology would enable in maybe some time, or maybe some parts have started already, right? At the village level, or perhaps even at the union council level. So that was one where farmers were demanding this, and we had to decide. We had gotten access. We collaborated with another organization that uses its own modeling, which is fairly accurate, to provide forecasts for Pakistan. The second question that we had to then answer was, which forecasts are important for farmers? What information within weather do they value the most? And at that point, our data collection, both in terms of surveys and focus groups, revealed three most desired parameters, right? One, the foremost being rainfall, considering that has direct implication in most of the farming related activities. Then it was wind and temperature, and then soil moisture and humidity. And rainfall was by and large quoted by everyone. That was number two, the question on what needs to be provided, because when you're providing something remotely or using technology, then naturally the attention span is not so much, right? Everyone will not pick up and listen to a 2 minute weather report on everything. So you have to decide on what works best. So that's where we try to use our human-centered design on how long the message should be. Should it be a text or a phone call? Should we start with the rainfall first and then talk about temperatures, and then maybe when there are serious deviations or anomalies in the weather, so if it's a heat wave that's detected, or a drought, or immense high amount of storms or winds, then we send out a separate warning alert. So those were some of the things that we had piloted on in the first season, and then in the second season when we launched this to more than, I think, about 250,000 farmers, if I'm not wrong. The third thing was about the duration of the forecast, right? So do we just provide the next day forecast? Do we provide something that's more seasonal? Do we provide something that's more bi-weekly? And there was a trade-off again, right? So seasonal forecasts are perhaps not as accurate as one would have liked. Because if I don't know how is it that the season, if a seasonal forecast is strong enough, then I will probably not be able to use it to decide my crop variety. If I've chosen my crop, then which variety do I plant? The short duration or the longer duration, the height resistant or the drought resistant variety, and so on. And then within the bi-weekly, we started to observe when we looked at the weather forecasting data from the past, I think 20 years it was, that the forecast compared to reality become a lot more accurate as much as when you start reducing the duration. And because we had a certain operational platform at that point, we settled with the next day um, forecast, which seemed to provide a lot of value and was also the most widely cited requirement from the farmers. So just now that we've built the context, can you maybe talk more about how we collected the data at that point? Because I remember this was a very, very tedious exercise. We were tracking the farmers throughout on a bi-weekly basis, and then we haven't had another round of data collection. What did the experiment look like? How did you collect data? And then once you do that, then we'll talk perhaps about the key findings a bit more.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, it was a really good example of a collaboration with the NGO and the government, and then kind of us a little bit more on the research side, right? Excuse me. I think that what you were saying was a really great point in terms of it's a combination of sort of what is available technically. So what's available technically in terms of high quality forecasts. There's a couple of constraints there, and it was kind of nice that farmers told us that they wanted 1 day to 2 day forecast, because that also increases the accuracy, right? So anytime that you're going to increase the lead time on a forecast, you're going to introduce some uncertainty. And so in addition to the communication of the expected level of precipitation and the expected temperature, you have to start to think about, okay, how do I provide the probabilistic information as the lead time gets bigger? And so with a narrow lead time, people are just kind of getting the most accurate information that's up to date. And so that has some convenience in terms of what's the most reliable too on the technical side. But then, of course, we're using administrative data. And so we get these kind of administrative rosters of several 100,000 phone numbers that are associated with cotton farmers in Punjab province. And we don't know their precise locations, right? So we only know their location down to the tehsil level. And so that just means that that's an operational constraint. So even if the best available weather would be able to identify maybe a 5 by 5 or 11 by 11 kilometer grid, you actually have to kind of go one step up and make it a little less granular given the technical capacity and what is actually known. So I think um, so I just wanted to highlight that because it's a really good point. So when we were setting up the measurement, we had the goal of understanding really high frequency what was happening on the ground. And so that meant that in a typical kind of impact evaluation, particularly in agriculture, you kind of concentrate your data collection at two periods. You take a baseline and in the pre-period where maybe you want to understand some like the average input decision of farmers, and then you take an end line where you're getting that yield information and you're getting the information about the kind of cumulative use of inputs throughout the season. But here we actually wanted to know what was happening like at very high frequent stages, right? So we set up a phone survey to call to like with random listings to call farmers and ask them one, what they thought the weather was going to be the next day. So we asked, do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? Which is kind of a weird question if you think about it, but we got like most people still responded to us. So what do you think? Do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? And then what do you think the temperature is going to be? And so we use that and we align that with the forecast that we know because we sent it, right? And so we can see that farmers' perception of whether it's going to rain tomorrow aligns with the forecast, right? So that's just sort of that first order outcome that
Yeah.
farmers are attending to the information and then it's causing them to update their beliefs about what the weather is going to be. The other thing that the high frequency phone survey enabled for us was the back check as well. So then we also asked, did it rain yesterday? And so then we know what forecast we provided them the day before, and we know whether that forecast said to expect any rain. And so we can do that back check as well as a measure of accuracy. And that back check is important because the way that weather information is generated, and this is kind of a frontier in AI and a frontier in machine learning, like there's a lot happening with increasing the accuracy of weather forecasts around the world, but they're using satellites. And in particular, in locations where there isn't a high grid of weather stations are still the gold standard for establishing weather patterns. And with satellites, you can do a lot more than before, but you're still constrained, right? So if you're using a satellite to predict the forecast, and you're also using that same satellite to then assess the accuracy, that accuracy is only as good as the kind of limitations on satellite forecasts in general. So where you don't have any weather stations, that means that you can't make systematic bias corrections on your accuracy of your forecasts, right? So in Pakistan and Punjab in particular, my understanding is that there's relatively few weather stations. And so we were partnered with an organization that was specialized in creating these forecasts. And so they did a bias correction in the whole of Punjab province to get those satellite measures towards something that we were confident was more accurate. But nonetheless, if you're not back checking it with the actual farmer reported data, that bias is just going to continue to persist, right? Because you have no way of knowing if it's accurate or not. So that's like a little bit on the more technical side of the importance of getting that like high frequency information. And so we do see, I was just looking at this data yesterday, we do see that there are certain tehsils where the forecasts perform relatively well compared to other tehsils. And I think what happens is that you have both variation in the size of the tehsil. So some are smaller than others. So you're naturally just going to have less space over which to have variation. So your means are going to be more relevant to more people. But then at the same time, you also have variation in elevation. And so that's one thing that makes a huge difference. And so cotton farmers in general are not growing in mountainsides. And so one thing that would be beneficial in a setting like this is that you kind of constrain your information to include only the areas that are relevant.
Great. So, yeah, I mean, Great, thanks, Jess. I think it was three layered data collection, as you said. At point number one, we were trying to ground truth the forecast information, just by confirming something with the farmers, did it rain yesterday or not, versus the forecast versus what we got as the real time data from the same organization. So that was the first layer of verification or at least estimation that we were doing. The second one was on do farmers actually recall that data or not, right? So that's when you were asking, do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? So we're telling them what the forecast is, and then we're asking them, do you think it's going to rain? Do you think it's going to be hot? And that's where we're trying to see whether farmers are listening to our forecasts, and those who are listening, whether they're able to retain that information, do they find it useful enough to retain it? That was number two. And then number three is where I think the impact or the intermediate outcomes start kicking in. So do they actually use that information for their farm level activities or farm level decision making? Just do you want to perhaps talk a little bit more about which farming activities show that they were influenced by provision of weather services, and as a way of farmers adapting to the changing climate and the changing weather forecasts, which activities were influenced, which were not. I understand that you pointed out that although immediate next day shorter term decisions seem to be more aligned with what was being forecasted, perhaps for the impact level outcomes, we are still a bit unclear on the outcomes of this intervention, because there might not have been a direct influence on the yields or the profits. But can you talk a bit more about those results, activity by activity?
Sure. I've got it up over here, so I'm going to just refer to it. One thing to note in how we set up this project as well is that we were very attentive to spillovers, right? So when we talk about information spillovers in this setting, we mean that people are going to share this information with each other. So we had an experimental design where we wanted to be able to measure those spillovers with some precision, because we think that this is very common in settings where you're delivering information that's very easy to share. And just in general, like with weather, people talk about weather and people share weather information with each other. And so we're able to see that in the results that we have from the farmer surveys as well. We see that farmers are more likely to share weather information with each other. So when we talk about these impacts, part of what we're able to see, because we were operating, again, relatively at scale compared to smaller projects, is that we were able to see that those spillovers were happening in terms of the timing of farming activities as well. And so the main farming activities that we tracked was the planting date, irrigation, fertilizer, pesticides, and then application of fungicides and herbicides. So fungicides and herbicides are a little bit less common, but you can think of sort of planting, well, you have to plant in order to be the farmer. Irrigation, fertilizer, and pesticides are sort of like some of the core practices that are common to farmers in this setting. And so what we see when we look at just the direct treatment effect is that farmers are like 3 to 4 percentage points more likely to run activities on days when it's sunny. And so again, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, that just means that farmers are averting doing these farming activities on days when it rains. And so if it's irrigation, that means that you're saving water resources because you're not pulling up from a water table, because you're aligning your irrigation with when it does rain, because you're irrigating on days that it's sunny. So that means that you're waiting on days that it rains. And then with fertilizer, we see that farmers are about 8 to 9 percentage points more likely to align with a sunny day. And fertilizer is a little bit confusing. I know, I don't know if there's any agronomists in the audience, because I've heard that you actually want to time your fertilizer so that you get a little bit of rain, because it can help, especially if it's like fertilizer applied directly on the soil. You kind of want like a little bit of absorption, but you don't want so much rain that it encourages leaching. And so we sort of just have abstracted away from that nuance a little bit here, and are saying, okay, it's not raining a lot when farmers are applying their fertilizer. So helps with the timing of fertilizer. And then with pesticides, it's a little bit more important, right? Because pesticides, you want to avoid applying on days that it rains, because then that just contributes to runoff. And so that's a really major area where we see people avoiding rainy days when they're applying pesticides. And they're also about 9 percentage points more likely to apply on a sunny day. Um, and then we see a little bit of movement in fungicides and herbicides, but are a little bit underpowered there. So going back to this idea of spillovers, what we also see is that it matters whether you're located in a tehsil where a lot of your peers are also assigned to treatment. And so
Mm,
that's an important finding because it illustrates the complementary effects of um, you know, like sending the information to a lot of people because they can use that information, communicate with each other, verify that information. Maybe they come up with rules of thumb for interpreting that information in a way that's relevant for their area. So all of that happens when a lot of people are assigned to treatment. So that's important both just in terms of establishing the presence of spillovers and establishing that people are sort of co-moving in those decisions. But it's also important because at a smaller scale, if you're not attentive to spillovers, that means that you're basically, you're handicapping yourself from estimating a treatment effect. You're not going to be able to estimate the differences because your controls end up being treated as well. So that's one
mm.
of the advantages of something that you can fine tune with a little bit more clarity when you're operating in a larger scale.
Perfect. Um, and just perhaps, I know we're running out of time, but maybe as a last question before I take questions from the audience, um, what would you say were the most pressing challenges as far as your own analysis and then coming up with key policy or non-policy related insights was concerned, both related to data collection, but also from the findings? What is it that was challenging, or you would say perhaps requires more investigation, and what is it that you're more confident about? I mean,
Mm.
more confidence we've already spoken a little bit about when it comes to the shorter term decision making, but what would you say are more policy level or even farmer decision making level challenges that emerge from this study?
That's a great question. Because we're always like a little bit constrained with what we can ask farmers, right? You can't call farmers and have an hour-long survey. That just
Yeah,
doesn't work. And so
yeah.
Pushpak and I were setting up an endline survey to complement the sort of survey that was taken throughout the course of the year, we called everyone back 1 year later so that we could get some of that kind of final analysis of the cumulative use of inputs and estimate profits and estimate yields. And so we weren't surprised when we didn't pick up on like treatment effect differences on yields and profits, precisely because of this point we were highlighting a little bit earlier of people are reallocating the timing, but they're not necessarily changing the levels that they're using, right? And so it's kind of like it kind of indirectly affects profits, but because we don't have good measures on labor, for example. So it could be that all of the profitability improvement from this type of activity in this setting comes from labor savings. So either
Mm,
farmers are using their time differently or they're hiring labor differently. And since we don't have great measures on own labor, because that's tremendously difficult to collect, then we're not like picking up on it, right? And
mm,
so I think from a policymaker's perspective, what do policymakers want to see in terms of agricultural interventions? They want to know if it affects yields and profits, right? And so
mm,
I do think that we can illustrate the benefits of weather forecasts, but we also have to be um, willing to sort of try and encourage policymakers to think about why the benefits aren't showing up in yields and why it still means it's something worth doing.
right. Um, Great. Um, Perhaps I think I'll start taking questions now. Yeah, I think we just have 6 minutes on the clock. I promise to try and take as many. I don't think we have a lot, but we have a few on the chat. So I'll start reading them out, going backwards. So an anonymous attendee is asking, can you please share your sample size and areas they were from? Um, yeah, this one is yours, Jess.
Sure. So the entire project was implemented with about 400,000 farmers whose phone numbers we had with the organization that we mentioned before. And then the survey information was with about 5,000 farmers. So we drew a sample from that larger pool to conduct these follow-up surveys. And the areas that they were from, I don't know if you mean like particular tehsils or districts, but if you're familiar with this region, it was just the main cotton growing districts and tehsils in Punjab province. So it wasn't the entire province, right? Because cotton production is concentrated in one of the main valleys there. So, but if you have any particular question about that, feel welcome to reach out and I can send you some more detailed information. But I don't think I'll list the tehsils here or anything.
Yeah, no, I can try and answer that a bit more. So we did like a big continuous round of high frequency surveys, as we like to call it at that point, where we were calling up farmers every week throughout the cotton season to understand what decisions were taking place at what point, and asking them questions about the forecasts and their recall and the actual weather that had materialized the day before. And then we did an end line after the cotton season the following year, to get insights on yields and profits from the previous season, as a follow-up. The intervention itself, as just mentioned, was with more than, I believe, the full population sample was more than 400,000, but with cotton we had around 250 or 300. I'm forgetting. That was the total population that was getting the intervention, and the samples were with the numbers that Jess has mentioned. And this was all from the cotton belt, right? So it's all of South Punjab, for your Khanibal, Multan, Bahawalnagar, Bahawalpur, Muzaffargarh, Lodra, Laya, Raimyar Khan districts. And then within that, we had tehsil level information of all of the farmers. I hope that answers the question. The second question is, sorry if I missed this, but is the service paid or will be paid in the future? How did you market it to the farmers? You shared that they were willing. Is there any where you were met with hesitance? No, this was a free of cost service because this was in collaboration with the extension department, and this was run with the grant of IFAD, which is a UN technical agency targeted at improving smallholder lives. So no, there was no service fee that was charged. How was it marketed? Well, we had been implementing the regular agronomic advisory for about two seasons before, and farmers had either registered for this, or the extension department had collected the data for the farmers, and they were free to opt out of the service if they did not like it. But our attrition rate was not as high as one would have imagined. Um, so in that sense, I wouldn't say there was a lot of hesitance. I mean, sure, over time there were some farmers who did not attend all of the calls or did not take daily call, especially those who were assigned to the treatment group of giving them a forecast call every morning. But other than that, no, not particularly. The third question is, how can we measure yield from subsistence farmers? Are there any methods you can recommend to try? This is Tim Leslie. Thanks, Tim, for the question. We tried to talk about this very briefly towards the start of the webinar, and we did agree that this is one of the more difficult estimates to achieve, especially when we're only asking the farmer about their own report of whatever is it that we're that they've harvested. One thing that I'm now trying to do as part of Better Cotton is that we're trying to get farmers to share their sales receipts. And if nothing else, farmers do know their farm area, and that's relatively easy to verify and doesn't is not as noisy as the yield data itself. So if you know the area, the total area farmer has, and you have the sales receipt, especially for cash crops, because then at least the division between self-consumption and selling out is not so burdensome. So you can use that sales receipt that usually when a smallholder farmer takes the produce to either the RT or the middleman or to a gin factory or whatever, they give them a sales receipt based on the weight of the final output, and that weight and the price is usually all mentioned in the receipts. So that's what we're trying to do right now, to try and get a more realistic version of yield estimates. But just, is there anything else apart from what farmer reports as also other more accurate yield estimates for smallholders?
Yeah, I think that and maybe we can follow up with that, and you can find my contact information, and I'm happy to provide more information about it. But the other best thing that's considered a best practice is doing crop cuts on field. So where you're kind of deliberately going to a farm and randomizing a row or a section of a plot and measuring it with precision.
Perfect. I don't know if there are other questions. Let me see the regular chat. Mm, no. Okay, I think this is more of a comment than a question. This is about the luxurious use of ACs to make proportion of humans more comfortable, but it also contributes to carbon emissions and other harmful gases, which is then increasing temperatures, and thus the process is repeated. And AC increases global warming, affecting nature. What one can do as an individual to prevent climate change at a lower, my guess is the mean at an individual level. Um, okay, so do you want to take that? Jess, I think the question is around what is it that we can do in an individual capacity to try and mitigate carbon emissions as much as possible.
Oh man, that's such a big question, right? I think that there are other people who think about this with a lot more clarity than me. So I'm just talking in the capacity of being a human on Earth, right? I think the thing people always emphasize is policy change, right? So we have to be working on our elections and at a level where we can influence policymakers to encourage measures that improve mitigation and adaptation. Of course, the onus of the obligation is on the kind of global north to transfer and facilitate adaptation and mitigation to the global south. And so, that's a big conversation that's happening. And I don't know the precise mechanisms that are in place, but you can imagine that at the COP meetings of the UN, people are figuring out how to pool those funds and reallocate them. And that's a really important process to ensure that that happens.
Yeah, I think at an individual level, if nothing else, what we can do is try and be more responsible with the use of carbon-based whatever technology, machinery, equipment that we're using. And in Pakistan, at least, most of it is still based on fossil fuels. Although now there is an increasing trend towards solar energy usage. At the farm level, at least, we're trying to move farmers towards more regenerative practices. So coupling your trying to minimize your regular tillage operations by improving soil health, things like cover cropping, intercropping, crop rotation, trying to use farmyard manure, biocomposting, and more responsible and efficient use of irrigation, both canal water as well as tube wells, um, um, and then again more responsible use of chemical pests and fertilizers by trying to use more natural sources of nutrients and pest control. So at a farm level or at a farmer level, those are some of the practices that one can try and adopt, both to adapt but also to mitigate to climate or the climate change. I think we're 3 minutes ahead. I don't think there are other unanswered questions. Maybe there's one more. What would you say is the recommended time frame for identifying longer term impact? Also, from farmers' perspective, what does impact look like? So this we've covered a bit, right? For the farmer, I think for a smallholder farmer in particular, in a country like Pakistan, their own livelihoods matter the most. So when we talk about livelihoods, it's about what is it they're getting economically, socially, and environmentally, and especially economically. Do they have stable yields or increasing yields, or are they reducing their cost of production? Are they improving their profits or incomes over time? In terms of labor or labor usage in the field, are they able to adapt to a changing climate? Do they have sufficient facilities to adapt to, let's say, very high temperatures, or or to droughts or to floods? Do they have enough resilience to be able to cope with such certain shocks which are becoming more frequent, unfortunately? For the longer term impact, I think, Jess, maybe you can comment on what is it that we can and potentially cannot do when it comes to evaluating certain interventions. There are limitations to collecting data, there are cost implications, and there are data collection methods which have their own limitations as well. But what would one say is a reasonable long-term time frame for truly evaluating impact?
That's a great question. So I know there are national panel surveys, and I think those are really effective at being able to understand, because in the national panel survey, you're following the same households over a long period of time. And so there's been some that are collected that have been around for almost a decade now, or even 15 years. And that information is really useful because you can get a better sense of those dynamics, right? So you can kind of get a sense of the yield dynamics, and you can get a sense of the shock dynamics. And so you can see that if someone experiences a shock, how long it takes them to recover, the frequency of shocks and things like that. For in an impact evaluation setting, it's an enormous limitation, because it's difficult to set up projects that are on a long enough time scale. Maybe the project lasts longer, but in terms of the evaluation tends not to last long enough to be able to capture all of the shocks that someone might experience. And so I don't know what to do other than setting up longer surveys, but I don't know who's going to pay for it.
Okay, great. I think we can stop here. Thank you, Jess, for participating. Thank you, the SERV team, for having us. It was a great discussion. Thanks, Jess, for sharing useful insights from the study, and I hope we all can take something out of it. Thank you, everyone else, to all the participants who've been here. I hope you have a nice rest of the weekend, and well, thanks, the SERV team.
Thanks,
Anything
everyone.
else, Zara or Amna, that you guys want to say before we log off?
No, all good. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, everyone. Take care.